All right, so let's get started here. Welcome, everyone. Here we are in August already. We've got a pretty full meeting today, so we'll just get rolling. I'm going to provide a general overview, as I usually do for any new folks. Try to get through that quick and get through the Stroud updates so that Jake and Matt have plenty of time. So just to review, this meeting is every third Thursday of the month, 2:30 to 3:30 every time. This is the same Zoom link every time, so keep that in your records, and you can just use that. Please, everyone, managers, station owners, please feel free to share the Zoom link and emails with your volunteers and others who you're working with if they'd like to attend. As another reminder, the attendees for these meetings are essentially anyone in the Delaware Basin, folks working directly with the Delaware River Watershed Initiative, as well as just folks who are working in the DRB, but not directly in the DRWI. We're able to support most groups just who are monitoring within the Delaware Basin with these EnviroDIY stations. We've also got some ability to support groups using seesaw funding. So Delaware River Watershed Initiative, check out this website, 4 States, 1 Source, if you want a little more information about the DRWI. Check out this website if you want a little bit of information about seesaw. So goals for these meetings, time to just check in, report issues, network. We provide updates, Stroud Center folks provide updates on all things EnviroDIY going on each month. And then we have a regular presentation each month. Facilitators, me, Rachel, Krista, Shannon. Krista is a part-time tech with Musconetcong, part-time tech with Stroud, also works with Musconetcong Watershed Association. Shannon is the primary EnviroDIY engineer. Rachel is an engineer technician. I'm facilitating it, everything. Then we've got Carol and George, who are master watershed stewards, who play a big role in kind of giving us feedback from the field and such. Meeting is being recorded, just keep that in mind. All these meetings recordings are available at this website. There's a lot of other resources there in addition to the videos, but all those videos are available here. And our primary goal with EnviroDIY in the Delaware River Basin is to support station owners, managers, and volunteers in using these stations for their own purposes. Secondarily, we're developing the broad data set, and we're developing tools to help characterize, analyze, and contextualize these watersheds according to the continuous data. So today's agenda, introduction, I'll get into the updates here in a few minutes. Jake Lemon and Matt Barney with Trout Unlimited have some really neat stuff they're doing across the country with EnviroDIY. We've been working closely with them for several years now on EnviroDIY. So I think this should be a really nice presentation today on their work. So just getting into Stroud updates here. As I mentioned last month, Rachel Johnson and I have been out in the field a lot, collecting grab samples from all of the EnviroDIY stations in the Delaware Basin. We are nearly finished, about 9. We've got a couple sites still to go. Here's the list of analytes that those samples will be processed for: suspended sediment, dissolved organic carbon, chloride, nutrients, and then cations. I announced this last month, but just want to encourage folks to use this. We're sort of piloting this service request form. It's just a way for us to gather information from folks whose stations are not functioning correctly. There's a series of questions that you will answer that will help us gather the information that we need in order to troubleshoot problems. So if you're having problems with your station and you need help with it, just feel free to go in here and fill out this form. And that form is located again at this website under service requests. You just click in there, it's a Google form, and you can just fill it out and submit it. You'll get a response email saying it was confirmed that you submitted it, and we'll be in touch accordingly. Just reviewing again, we have in this resources website, we have a support supplies list of important kind of support supplies, such as SD cards and adapters, power. You know, a lot of these stations, well, not a lot, some of these stations need to have batteries cycled in and out. So there's information here on how to, on sites that you can order those products from. Also pointing out that this new recommended roles and responsibilities for managing EnviroDIY monitoring station, again, at this website under quick guides. And it just lays out 4 different basic roles that can be taken in managing these stations. The owner or manager of the station kind of making sure that these other duties are met. So monitor my watershed, doing the weekly maintenance, cleaning sensors and such, and then doing quality control. Some updates on technology. The new cell boards, we're making progress on that. These are cell boards that are Shannon just went ahead and developed her own cell board because we were having problems with the manufacturer ones. And these will be available in less than a month. So that's great news. An updated Mayfly data logger and additional accessories will also be available in less than a month. And we'll have some time at the end where if anyone has questions for Shannon on that, you can go ahead and ask those. But it looks like next month, Shannon is going to be giving a presentation on all of these new things that are coming available. One of those being this Campbell's new Clairview turbidity sensor is now available. We're currently testing some other ones. So hopefully sometime in the next, months, we will be able to start replacing old turbidity sensors or malfunctioning turbidity sensors with new turbidity sensors that work better than the old ones. Just kind of housekeeping in terms of station maintenance to point out. In our grab sample collection, Rachel and I really started identifying that it seems like it's probably pretty important for folks to remove the bundles from the stream every now and again. It's pretty situational in terms of how often that needs to be done according to what's happening in the streams. But you get, in some streams, you get silt accumulation that can get in here in between the rebar and the PVC and can kind of seal these PVCs to the rebar. And so removing the PVC from the rebar by taking that pin out from time to time can help in preventing that PVC from sealing to the rebar. These rebars also get rusty. So, you know, as that happens, it can kind of cause the PVC to kind of get stuck to the rebar. So taking it off can help with that. And also taking off the sensor bundle can also just help with being able to more thoroughly clean the sensors. So here you can see how the bottom, sometimes that can be hard to access if you don't take the whole bundle out. And you can also get in here into the slot to clean those CTD or those conductivity screw heads a little better. And then sometimes you get these situations where if you don't pull it out and don't really thoroughly scrub it, or even just look at it, you may not really know how quickly debris and algae and such are accumulating. So it's just a good idea to take the bundle out. Jake pointed out that his group is taking them out once a year, or his recommendation was to take out at least once a year. So probably that's a good minimum requirement, but some of these, it might be good to even take them out on a quarterly basis. Now, if your sensor has already kind of been in there a while and has gotten kind of sealed in a way to the rebar, the PVC has gotten sealed, then it may be good to kind of take it easy, because that may, if you try to pull it out, you may pull the entire rebar out. So you want to be careful. I'd say be delicate with it. Feel free to be in touch. If the sensor is functioning fine, maybe you just go with it until it's at a point where you just need to replace this entire rebar. But feel free to be in touch if you're in one of those scenarios where the PVC is kind of fixed to the rebar. Okay, so this is just a fun slide of taking the bundles out and really inspecting the sensors can be useful. This little guy had made a home in this space holder for turbidity. But what also can happen, and Carol Armstrong has found this several times, but you get creatures living in the CTD sensor in that slot on the CTD sensor as well, which also is a reason to take those bundles out and to really look into that slot to make sure there's nothing hanging out in there or eggs or anything like that. Okay, so a number of updates today. We did a survey last month, and we got pretty good feedback as far as, we were asking about if the format was suitable. Most folks seem to think the format of these meetings was suitable. We had a few comments. I'll just read these quickly. Most of the publicly accessible free presentations that I run across are not technical or in-depth enough, so I'm glad there is a venue at Stroud for deeper dives into topics. So it seems like that is kind of where we're going with this, where we try to kind of keep it pretty technical so that folks can kind of, reach for higher levels of understanding in these things. Sometimes it'll be too deep, but we have a diverse audience, so kind of that's just kind of the nature of these meetings. You might consider having multiple 5-minute presentations by attendees. They could talk about their pet project without having to do a formal PowerPoint for the discussion. So I'd like to talk about that more today, maybe here in the updates, but maybe we can do it after Jake and Matt are finished. But it seems like it might be appropriate, maybe quarterly or something like that, to have folks just chime in 5 minutes, 7 minutes, whatever, and talk about what they're doing with their own personal station situations. Last one, I wonder if there is any way to facilitate more conversation after the presentations about the participants presenter, a time where folks might reflect, consider how the presentation affects their own work, etc. Just a little bit deeper conversation than we get into during a quick Q&A after presentations. Although prompting conversation like this is especially difficult on Zoom, I understand the challenge of this suggestion. It is challenging. I'm always available to stay on these meetings after the hour. We try to stop them right at the hour, but in a call like today, Jake, Matt, you can certainly stay on if you'd like afterwards today, and I'll stay on afterwards if folks want to talk more about Jake and Matt's presentation. But there's also potential opportunities to have completely side meetings to have specific areas of discussion. So, if anyone wants to be proactive about kind of suggesting something for that, or even potentially organizing something like that, please speak up, be in communication with me, and we can go from there. We're also thinking about doing several meetings throughout the year, kind of like I kind of started this off with a meeting a couple months ago where it was a EnviroDIY in the DRB. Where have we come from? Where are we going? Shannon's going to continue this with a extensive review of all of the new tech upgrades that are going to be happening in the next several months. She's going to be doing that, it looks like, in September in next month's meeting. So we're not going to pattern that yet, but hopefully it'll be every 3 or 4 months that we'll do a EnviroDIY, a directly related EnviroDIY review session for these meetings. Okay. So as I mentioned, September 16th is the next meeting. Shannon's going to be doing those updates on mayfly upgrades, cell boards, new sensors, new code, monitoring, new monitoring kits, etc. So we have some ideas for October. I'd like to put it out here right now for you to, all attendees here, think about whether you'd be willing and able to talk for 5 minutes or so about what you're doing. Maybe it's just posing questions to the group, whatever, but I think it's might be appropriate at this point to allocate some meetings from time to time for attendees to kind of voice, you know, either their concerns or kind of talk about what they're doing with their own, you know, local watersheds, etc. Here's a few examples of folks that are kind of ready to go with that type of talk. So please just, we can talk about it after Jake and Matt's presentation too, but please just be in touch with me if there's, if you feel like you'd like to do that in October, and we'll kind of line folks up just so that we have a kind of an informal list. All right, so any questions before we move on at this point? No? Okay. So we've got Jake Lemon and Matt Barney here today. Jake is based out of Michigan. Matt is based out of Boise, Idaho. They work pretty closely together in facilitating deployment of EnviroDIY monitoring stations in Michigan and other locations across the country. Jake has facilitated deployment of a number of stations in the Delaware Basin. And they are going to talk to us today about their program and how that's been going. So I will stop share and pass it off to, who's starting you guys off? Matt or Jake?
Jake is.
All right, so Jake, go ahead and take it away.
All right, let's get this shared. Do you see, are we good? Do you see my screen?
Yep, I see it, Jake.
Okay, great. Well, hey, everybody. Thanks for the introduction, David. I'm TU's Monitoring and Community Science Manager. I'm based in West Michigan, and I facilitate and support our staff and volunteers to incorporate data collection and volunteer-based data collection into their activities and their priorities and strategic planning. And so I work a lot in the Great Lakes, but I do have stuff going on throughout our eastern region, which is basically everywhere east of the Mississippi plus Minnesota. And I'm joined by Matt Barney. And maybe, Matt, do you want to just expand a little introduction to yourself?
Sure, thanks, Jake. I'm Matt Barney. I'm based in Boise, Idaho, as David said. I'm part of TU's National Science Team, generally based here in Boise. My background is in software development. I've been with Stroud Unlimited now for, I think, 13 years or so. So I do a number of different software and technologically related tasks in support of primarily of the science team and also other programs across the country.
Thanks, Matt. So today we're just going to talk about our experience with EnviroDIY, kind of I guess share info on our model or how we've deployed this effort in the organization. Share some case studies of particular areas where we're doing some interesting monitoring, and then talk just a little bit about some of the, I guess, technical R&D we've done over the past year and a half, or some of the technical issues we've run into and how we've overcome them. So Just to provide a little background on TU for any of you who are not familiar with our organization, we're a nationwide nonprofit dedicated to the conservation of cold water streams in their watershed. So basically, we work where there are cold water fish like trout and salmon. Our approach is to basically protect these watersheds and especially in their headwaters, reconnect streams by remediating culverts that are fish passage barriers or dam removals, that sort of things, to interconnect habitat, restore degraded habitat, and then sustain our work through public and youth environmental education. We have sort of a loosely structured nationwide community science program where we provide support and tools to our staff and chapters to conduct citizen science or community science efforts in the context of the work that they're doing. And so we're organized into, basically we have the local chapter level, which is a volunteer board, led chapter. I think there's like 400 plus throughout the country. I know in Pennsylvania, we have somewhere around 40 or 50 chapters. There's a lot of chapters in Pennsylvania. And these folks are usually working on cold water conservation issues in those local areas where they're based, working on restoration and education and advocacy in their local streams and rivers. And then we have field staff that are employed by the national organization that are kind of distributed all over the place, of which I'm one. And I think there's about 350 or so staff at the organization now, all over the U.S. pretty much in most places where there are trout. We have state councils that are basically sort of a body that brings together all the chapters in a state to work on state level issues, and we have a volunteer led board there. Some of our councils also have full-time staff. So there's sort of multiple tiers or multiple levels of the organization that are all, collaborating on cold water conservation and on community science. So just briefly, just thought I'd touch on the importance of temperature to trout because temperature monitoring drives a lot of the monitoring that we do. I know outside of EnviroDIY, I probably deployed, or my techs deployed, probably close to 100 temperature sensors in Michigan this year. And so a lot of the work we do is aimed at understanding the distribution of habitat that is thermally suitable for fish. So cold water species like trout and salmon need cold water to survive. And they have sort of preferred temperature ranges that vary a little bit based on species, but generally we're talking, somewhere where maximum temps don't exceed sort of the mid 60s or closer to 70 in some cases. And so a lot of the work we do is aimed at remediating issues that elevate temperature, basically, and making sure we have suitable thermally suitable habitat. And then a lot of the monitoring that we're doing is aimed at understanding where that distribution is, so we can help prioritize and identify where we do these types of projects. And so this EnviroDIY really feeds it into that. So I thought I'd just call that out briefly. So we've been, Matt and I have been involved with EnviroDIY, I think since 2017-ish, somewhere around there. I used to be based in Bellefonte, Pennsylvania, and was involved in some deployments in the Delaware River Basin with Stroud and some other partners like the Aquashicola Watershed Association and some TU chapters out there. And so I had sort of a somewhat of a understanding of the technology and what it could do, and was pretty excited about it. And in moving to the Midwest and building some new programs out here, I actually worked with Shannon and some other folks at Stroud to host the first EnviroDIY training here in West Michigan back in 2019. So their crew road tripped out here and we held a training, deployed 5 stations, and that really kicked off a ton of interest in the area in these lower cost solutions for real-time monitoring. And you know, we had a lot of folks reaching out to us at wanting this in their watershed. So Matt and I kind of put our heads together and developed a plan to bring the capacity in-house at TU, where we could basically provide a similar service that Stroud provides in the Delaware River Basin, where we're providing training and technical support, field-based support, and actual, you know, programming and assembling stations in-house and distributing them to our chapters primarily, but also other partners. So Matt and I spent probably a better part of a year just getting up to speed on doing all this, you know, building these things, programming them, testing them, deploying, and that whole deal. And we started holding our own trainings. I guess it would have been last summer, I believe, was our first set of trainings. So what was planned to be in person turned into a webinar-based training program that was augmented by sort of smaller group in the field training. And so we work with a number of partners where we'll help them through much like Shroud works in the through DRWI. We'll help them identify suitable locations, train them on how to understand the data, maintain the stations, and provide sort of ongoing tech support here in Michigan to TU chapters and watershed associations and other partners like municipalities and agencies. We have, I think, about 25 stations here in Michigan now, probably, or thereabouts. I actually just deployed one this morning. And it started to generate some interest outside of the state, both among our staff and chapters. So the program has slowly started to grow, where we're doing deployments nationwide. We have stations in New York and in Oregon, and some other that are in the works in other states. And so, generally, we're just sort of a central knowledge hub that allows our staff to more easily access and utilize this technology and these resources to answer monitoring questions that they have in their local watersheds. So before I steal too much thunder from future slides, I'm going to kick it off to Matt here to talk about our community science framework.
Yeah, thanks, Jake. As Jake touched on, we're Trout Unlimited is kind of a collaboration from a volunteer network, both members and non-members, folks who just want to participate in restoration and other work in their local watersheds, to a full professional staff, which includes the science team, of which I'm a part, based here in Boise. It's a handful of us, geneticists, GIS professionals, biologists, and so forth, as well as what we call our science network that's pictured here. There's about 30 some folks who all have generally advanced degrees in the sciences, who both do research as well as implement projects on the ground. We have volunteer operations staff who kind of help interface and coordinate between the grassroots and our staff, as well as project staff located around the country, restoration specialists who are seeking funding, seeking expertise, and making on-the-ground improvements in their local areas. So the EnviroDIY system really was a clear opportunity for us to sort of knit all these things together and serve just a tremendous variety of needs, which, as Jake mentioned, we're kind of getting rolling on that, and it sort of self-perpetuates. Definitely generates a lot of interest across the organization, both in the grassroots and among our professional science staff.
Thanks, Matt. So I've touched on this a little bit, but just to further explain sort of our process or how we work. here in Michigan, the model is, like I said, fairly similar to the Shrouds, or somewhat similar to Stroud's work in the DRWI, to the DRWI project, where we provide a lot of hands-on support to our partners, including in-person training. We help with station deployment. We come out to stations to assist with troubleshooting when needed, and that sort of thing. We hold, somewhat regular trainings for both new and already engaged volunteers on basically methods for maintaining and working with the data and doing quality checks and that sort of thing. But we also have some other models of support with our chapters and our staff and other partners, where, in some cases we may have a staff person who is interested in adopting this, and will basically sort of provide remote tech support and mail them a mostly assembled, ready to go station, and then they'll go out and deploy that on their own and do their own quality control, of course, and troubleshooting and all that with remote support from us. So and then in some cases we may have folks who have more technical acumen, who want to build, and source the materials and, develop the code, or not develop, but program the loggers on their own. And we've got a few of those where we've just, it's basically answered questions as they've come up, and they've been able to, put together their own stations. And so we're kind of really just meeting people where they are and just trying to remove barriers wherever they are among our constituency to access this technology and utilize it in their streams and rivers. So, that's kind of how we plan to proceed moving forward. I do have, I'm hoping to set up additional sort of regional knowledge bases where we can provide additional support to our chapters and our staff. We have myself here in Michigan that has done a lot of work here, and then Matt in Idaho, but we have staff throughout the country, and sort of a long-term goal is to identify other staff with an interest in this type of thing that could sort of serve as regional support bases or knowledge hubs to help this proliferate around the organization. And then the only other thing I'll mention is just our funding. Most of this has been funded through foundations. We try to keep the cost of the stations down by removing, our time from the equation, or as far as when we charge partners for stations. But generally, when a partner comes on board, in some cases the station components are funded by grants that we found, but often our partners are basically paying for the hardware and then just a little bit of Matt's time to put it together, but they still receive that full-on support from me. And again, we're able to keep that cost down by finding foundation funding to support our time, both providing the tech support here in Michigan and then elsewhere. And we've had a lot of interest from private donors and chapters to support this project, and that's allowed it to grow here in Michigan quite quickly, actually. So just jumping into a few quick case studies. One I like to talk about is Kids Creek. So this is a small watershed in Traverse City, which is in the basically the northwest part of the Lower Peninsula of Michigan. And it's pretty big city, at least for that part of the state. And this is a fairly urban watershed, but one that has great cold water temperatures for fish. There are brook trout in parts of this watershed. They do get some runs of steelhead and salmon as well. But a good chunk of the watershed there that you see in this map on the right is listed as impaired by the state, basically due to the graded benthic macroinvertebrate communities. And there's been, I think, somewhere around $8 million invested in this watershed over the past couple decades on green infrastructure and vegetative buffers and other things to try to get at the issue here, which is understood to be the hydrology, basic flashiness stormwater issues in this watershed, and it's really not moved the needle as far as, you know, trying to move this watershed out of 303 and de-impaired status. And there's been some conjecture over the years that salt applications could potentially be what, you know, a limiting factor for benthic macroinvertebrate communities in this watershed. And so we deployed, because that's sort of been an open question, it came to our attention, and we deployed a couple stations there last December. Actually, you'll see the one on the left there. It's right below a Meyer parking lot. There's tons of big box stores sort of in this area, road salt applications. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this issue. And so we deployed that there, and we found that just in that first winter anyway, the baseline conductivity hovered somewhere around 600 microsiemens per centimeter, which, our conductivity is in Michigan is probably generally higher than what you see in Pennsylvania, other than maybe the most urban areas, because we have such high groundwater inputs in these streams. And so, groundwater has a higher conductivity than surface flow generally. But 600 is still, a little bit elevated from what we're used to seeing, not necessarily alarmingly so. And then, corresponding with snow events and melt events, we did see some significant spikes in conductivity up to, 2,500 or so microsiemens per centimeter. So, significant spikes. And it was enough to sort of get the state's interest and start to develop some interest in exploring that potential impact a little bit further. We have a brand new chloride criteria or standard here in the state, and the state's trying to figure out how to basically effectively monitor for that new criteria. And so this has started some conversations, not just in the Kids Creek watershed, but in the other urban watersheds as to, how, is salt potentially a limiting factor in some of these watersheds that's driving their impairment. So that was sort of an interesting project. Another one that's come up here is where we're leveraging sort of recreation interests to monitor aquatic resources. So there's a number of rivers here in Michigan that are world-renowned cold water fisheries for brown trout, steelhead, salmon, brook trout, and other species. One that you may have heard of is the Pere Marquette River. So that's about an hour and a half from where I live. And there's, as soon as there's like, I think something like, I may be overstating it, but I think there's about 50 guides and outfitters who operate at least partially on this river. So it's sort of an economic engine for the region. And, something that when they heard about this opportunity to get real-time depth and temperature data at a relatively low cost, there was basically a ton of interest in several watersheds here in Michigan from these outfitters and fly shops and whatnot. And so, their interest, a lot of it is driven by sort of their bottom line, having the best information to inform, when and where they take clients fishing. They've also used the data to advocate for sort of self-imposed moratoriums on fishing during thermally stressful conditions. So basically, a lot of these operate as catch and release fisheries. Even with catch and release fishing, if you're doing that during hot periods of the year when their water temperatures are high, into the 70s, even with catch and release, you're trying to manage this so that these fish, remain in the stream. Even with catch and release during those warmer temperatures, you're often killing a lot of those fish. So those guides were using this data to sort of inform when they fish, and then sort of develop a community self-imposed moratorium to not fish during those high temperature periods to preserve that resource that they utilize. And then, of course, they're interested in sort of establishing long-term baseline conditions. These watersheds are experiencing not a lot of any kind of extractive development, but residential development is increasing in a lot of these watersheds. So there's a sort of a an interest in starting to develop long-term baseline data sets so that we can understand and evaluate what and if anything is changing in these watersheds as more and more homes are built and it's more and more developed. So right now, this is a PM. This gray one, I actually just deployed this morning, and we had a donor offer to cover 4 more stations in the watershed. So we're looking to hopefully capture some of the tributaries. And so we're going to have a pretty heavily monitored watershed where that funding is really coming from sort of a recreation economy standpoint, but where we're getting the benefits to conservation as well by collecting this establishing these long-term data sets. So kind of a cool model that's popped up out here. I'll kick it to Matt.
All right. So I wanted to mention a couple of use cases for EnviroDIY out west here. The first one dealing with Beaver Dam Analogs, also known as BDAs, or sometimes called artificial beaver dams. And you see an example one here on the left in the Truckee Basin. Basically, the idea is to mimic the function of a natural beaver dam and provide ecosystem services such as trapping sediment, slowing down the stream flow, raising the water table, reconnecting the stream with its floodplain, and so forth. In the case of the Sycan River, it's a tributary in the Upper Klamath Basin in Southern Oregon. Historically, beavers were eradicated from that landscape. There's also been grazing impacts that have combined to increase sedimentation in the river. And as it turns out, the other facet of that is that the local geology is relatively high in phosphorus. So all of this sediment transport, you get that phosphorus moving down and collecting in Klamath Lake, and it really exacerbates algal blooms down there. So Trout Unlimited staff are doing restoration on the Sycan River involving Beaver Dam Analogs and some cattle exclosures. And so we have implemented just this year 2 EnviroDIY stations above and below that treatment reach. So basically a control and a treatment station. And we're focusing primarily on turbidity to get at that sedimentation issue. For this application, we substituted a different turbidity sensor than the Campbell OBS3 Plus that we've used in the past. This is a wipered sensor pictured on the lower right there. So because this site is relatively remote, takes a long time for our hydrologist to get there. So he's benefiting from having a sensor that requires less maintenance. Also really loves to be able to obviously see the real-time data from his desktop. We hadn't used this sensor before, so it was kind of my first foray into doing major customization or relatively major customization of the EnviroDIY and modular sensor code base. And one of the things I was focused on was that wiper draws more power, as you might expect, than a non-wipered sensor. So I built some circuitry to do some careful power consumption measurements, be able to evaluate the battery drain, and it kind of inform how we size the solar panel for that location. So it's been a real win, and our science folks are really happy to have those systems and more on the way, actually. Next slide, please. Another application that Trout Unlimited focuses on, or another restoration or protection area, I should say, is maintaining in-stream flows. Out west, particularly, there's a lot of diversion for irrigation. And so that can actually dewater streams to the point where trout can't survive, or they lose a large portion of habitat for parts of the year. So in this case, this is in the Wallowa River Watershed in Oregon. We used an EnviroDIY station to monitor stage in this diversion ditch. So we're actually monitoring the amount of water that's being diverted from the river as part of working with local partners to improve those in-stream flows. In this case, I installed an ultrasonic, Maxbotics ultrasonic distance sensor to the bottom of that bridge that you see, along with a staff gauge for cross-checking. But basically, so the ultrasonic sensor is just measuring the distance to the surface of the water. They developed a flow rating curve, so from that they can infer or estimate the actual volume that's flowing through that ditch and understand how these diversions are impacting the main stem river. So next slide, please. As Jake mentioned, we encountered a number of technical challenges as we kind of came up to speed on the platform. Being such a distributed organization, customizing mayflies for specific installations and managing change in the code base are challenges. But so the question that Jake and I encountered early on was, how do we support all these mayfly deployments across such a broad distributed organization? And kind of the answer, one of the big answers was kind of limit the spread of complexity. So what I mean by that is, not everyone needs to be a programmer in this case. And we can kind of centralize that expertise and build that knowledge base that Jake spoke of. And I mostly ship out fully assembled and pre-programmed kits, particularly to volunteers, for example, so that they're relatively turnkey. And then Jake and I provide that level of tech support, as you mentioned. The other way we kind of limit the spread of complexity is by generally focusing on a standard configuration, which is a CTD sensor. It's been very stable and it's a well understood system for us. And then kind of an interesting use case that Jake and I realized as we were getting our feet wet with the system was that when we needed to do code customizations and really get in and program them, rather than have multiple people, Jake and others, having to set up the full development environment to program the mayfly, what we do occasionally is I'll build that system, I'll build all that code and those customizations in my development environment, from which it generates a binary file that I can just ship off to, say, Jake. And he's actually had cases where he's been able to reprogram a mayfly by me just emailing that binary file to him to address issues right on site. So it's installable from the command line and doesn't require the overhead of learning the entire development environment. So that's been a help in certain specific cases. One other thing to mention is that we just try to do a lot of extensive, benchtop or desktop testing before we ship things to the field to alleviate some of those problems. So that's the first part of the answer. And on the next slide, addressing technical challenges, we've just realized that it's critical that we leverage EnviroDIY community as much as possible. That there are such extensive tools and documentation that Stroud has provided for us that it's a great resource that way. We also are active participants in the community. It's really expanded our network of expertise that we can draw on. And we also try to share what we've learned. One example was that when we first got started, we realized some of our sites just had very poor to no coverage from AT&T, and we could not get the hologram SIM cards to connect to Verizon networks, even where there were strong Verizon signals. So with a little bit of tinkering and R&D, we discovered an alternative SIM card that would allow those Verizon only areas to be online. So, the community And we shared those findings back with the community, and that community has just been, it's central to what makes this whole thing work for Shroud Unlimited and to be an important solution for so many of these challenges. And I think that's my last slide. So our contact information is there. Email formats, our email addresses are in a little bit different format, but either one, this format or the one that Dave showed are fine. You can reach out to us. And thanks for your time. Happy to answer any questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Matt and Jake. That was really informative. We are at 3:22 right now, so why don't we field questions for Jake and Matt. Jake, why don't you stop share, or at least for the time being, and we can see about questions. Anyone have questions for Jake and Matt? Anyone? Anyone? Jim Coffey has one finger up.
Yeah, I'm a member of Shroud Unlimited and our chapter, Perkiomen chapter in southeastern Pennsylvania. We have a mayfly station in a local stream here that does have brown trout. And my question would be would it be beneficial for us to hook up and share data with the TU? We're obviously sharing with EnviroDIY and Stroud, but would it be beneficial to team up with you guys and actually hook up where we could share our data with you? That's my question.
So I suspect your data is going up onto monitormywatershed.org, which is actually the same database that we're using for all of our deployments. So that data is publicly accessible. It's in the same place, even though it may fall under a different umbrella. And, if we filter on or Monitor My Watershed for TU stations, it may not come up. I don't know that there's any sort of active steps needed for that. This is something that's come up where we've had interest from chapters that are in the Delaware River Basin. And generally my feeling is that Stroud is probably better positioned to provide support for TU chapters that are within that basin. And then sort of if you're outside their scope, then, Matt and I can kind of start to fill some of that need for technical support. I guess, so that's my perspective.
I'd just add briefly that those data that you're collecting, especially as you accumulate them over time, could potentially be of value to your local biologists, including TU staffers or agency folks and so forth. So it's great that you're building that up in Monitor My Watershed.
Absolutely.
So it sounds like Jake and Matt, your kind of format for support is similar to Stroud's in the stations themselves, but also in that you're primarily providing stations to groups to use for their own local purposes. Is there any thinking or direction towards broad scale analysis of data from these groups distributed in Michigan and elsewhere?
Yeah, so you're right. We see ourselves as basically service providers that allow folks to collect this kind of data to answer local questions. We do use the data here and I have used data, especially here in Michigan, here and there for other projects. But at this point, I don't know that there's a goal for some sort of nationwide analysis of these data. I mean, perhaps down the road as the network grows, that might make more sense. But at this point, it's more about sort of place-based local questions that need to be answered.
Yeah. Good. Thanks, Jake. All right, any other questions or let me see, here's something in the chat here. Oh, Edie Stevens with the Broadhead Watershed Association is asking, and I had this question too, actually. Thanks, Edie. What is the chloride standard in Michigan, that new standard you mentioned?
I thought of that right before I got on the call. It's like, somebody's going to ask me what that standard is. And I knew it a few months ago. So I'd have to look that up.
Okay.
I don't know it off the top of my head.
It's a good question though, Edie. And, you know, there's a wide variety of standards that I have seen recently regarding chloride. EPA's standards are 230 and 860, I believe, chronic and acute and chronic, I should say. I've seen as low as 50 milligrams per liter. That is used for a few sections of the Delaware River, and also in Maryland, in a couple ecoregions in Maryland, they set a 50 milligrams per liter criterion. That is super low, I think, in terms of what data have shown in terms of impact to aquatic systems. Here we go. Final chronic value, thanks, Jake. 150, wow, okay. Aquatic maximum value 320, final acute value 640. So those are lower than EPA. So that's very interesting.
Yeah, I believe you guys have done some of this, but we're wanting to start to develop some chloride conductivity curves at some of these sites that have, you know, been somewhat problematic. We have some sites in the Grand Rapids metro area where we've seen some, you know, very significant conductivity spikes, and even, you know, sustained elevated conductivities that might maybe indicate, you know, groundwater contamination as well. And so, you know, it's definitely a need that's out there to better evaluate that.
Yeah, in these urban areas, at least what we're seeing in southeastern PA in particular, there's seems to be most definitely groundwater contamination where these streams are running base flow. We've been doing longitudinal monitoring on a stream in Westchester recently. I've been working with a high school student actually who's been doing that, and she's been finding chloride levels in the headwaters of this stream that are in an urban area that exceed EPA standards for chloride. So that's not storm related, that's not winter time, that's summertime base flow. So it's definitely, and those levels have more than doubled in about 10 to 15 years, because there was historic data on this stream as well. So it's really going up, this freshwater salinization. Okay, so we are actually at 3:30 now. And let's see, Mike Buller just posted a fact sheet on Michigan chloride and sulfate plan. So that's interesting. So everyone pop into the chat if you want that link. That Buller is a pretty sharp guy. So I think he's might be onto something there. Okay, I thought I wanted to see if anyone had any, if anyone wanted to volunteer here and now for talking about your individual work next month, or if you have any other things to discuss right now, either continuing with conversation with Jake and Matt, or anything else that has come up, any questions you have or issues or whatever. Anyone? Anything else to discuss? Any more questions for Jake and Matt? Anyone? Okay, well, I guess we can call it a meeting if there's nothing else on the radar for anyone. Certainly, I'll stay on for a bit here, and Jake and Matt, if you're able to stay on, just in case there's folks that aren't speaking up that would like to discuss in a smaller group. I'll stay on and I'll stop recording as well. And we can go from there. So I'll stop recording now. Thanks everyone for attending. We'll see you next month. Please reach out to other volunteers, other folks who might want to attend. Okay, so stopping recording.